Hello and welcome to the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Cipher Brief CEO and publisher, Suzanne Kelly. Well, to state what may seem like the obvious, the world is in a much different place than it was under the first Trump administration. Closer alliances between U.S. adversaries are shaping a new world order. Russia continues to challenge both the U.S. and Europe with its illegal invasion of Ukraine. And despite an agreement that has seen the freeing of some hostages, the war that has ravaged Gaza and launched after a horrific terrorist attack in October of 2023 is once again demonstrating the fragility of peace in the Middle East. Those are all the things we knew before President Trump began his second administration, and not unexpectedly, the new president has added a few issues to our radar, like the strategic importance of Greenland to U.S. national security. In this episode of The World Deciphered, Cipher Brief contributing editor Elaine Shannon sits down with Ambassador Dennis Ross to talk about what opportunities await the new administration in the Middle East. Cipher Brief managing editor Tom Nagorski talks with Ambassador Kurt Volker and retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges about how the new U.S. president may make good on his promise to end the war in Ukraine. Cipher Brief senior international correspondent Iya Mermishvili is talking with former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Ian Brzezinski and former Deputy Secretary General of NATO Ambassador Alexander Vershbow about the U.S. relationship with NATO and how that might change with the new administration. And we're talking with retired General Phil Breedlove, former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, about what's driving President Trump's ambitions in Greenland. All of that is coming up, but first it's time to check in on the stories that are really getting the most buzz at the cipherbrief.com with Cipher Brief managing editor Tom Nagorski. Tom?
Well, Suzanne, there's really one major story this week. That's the inauguration of Donald Trump. And from day one, we're watching a range of national security questions. First, the war in Ukraine. As you'll recall, as a candidate, Donald Trump pledged repeatedly, "I'll end the war in 24 hours." Now his special envoy is saying we'll end the war in 100 days, and that's still an ambitious target. And it raises questions about what concessions the president may be able to win from the Kremlin, and when and under what circumstances he will meet Vladimir Putin. We have a big takeout on the 100-day plan the Trump administration has put forward at thecipherbrief.com. Moving to China, it's worth noting that for all the orders handed down on Inauguration Day, the promised major tariffs against China weren't among them. They may still be coming, and while tariffs technically aren't a national security issue, anything that adds to tensions in the U.S.-China relationship can spiral quickly into a national security concern for Washington. Then there are the two items that weren't on anyone's lists of global flashpoints for 2025, Greenland and the Panama Canal. President Trump on Inauguration Day repeated his aim to gain U.S. control over Greenland for national security reasons. Greenland is the sovereign territory of Denmark, a NATO ally, so that's complicated to say the least. And he claims that China has taken control over the Panama Canal and that the U.S. would, quote, take back the canal. In fact, China doesn't control the canal, Panama does, but there are nuances or seeds of truth, you might say, in both these cases. We explore the Greenland and Panama questions on our site as well. And lastly, of course, there is the long-awaited deal to bring a ceasefire to Gaza and to bring some of those hostages home. Here we saw an unprecedented case of two U.S. administrations involved simultaneously in global diplomacy. A long, painstaking effort by the Biden team right up until its last days, and in its last days, last-minute involvement of a Trump Middle East envoy. The deal, still in its early days, is holding, and as former presidential Mideast envoy Dennis Ross told us the other day, this is now a Trump agreement. It will be on the new administration to help bring a 6-week deal into something more permanent. Busy day, Suzanne. Back to you.
Thanks, Tom. You can check out more of the stories that the Cipher Brief is covering and all of the expert analysis that comes with it at thecipherbrief.com. Well, during his first few days in office, President Trump signed a number of executive orders undoing much of what was done under the Biden administration. But in a rare display of coordinated leadership, both the Biden and Trump administrations worked together to help bring about a deal that saw the release of some hostages in the Middle East. Cipher Brief contributing editor Elaine Shannon sat down with a former assistant to the president in the Middle East, Ambassador Dennis Ross, to talk about how the deal came together and what it might tell us about future Trump administration policy toward the Middle East.
His administration owns this agreement. We have an unusual relationship. In fact, I can't think of any that is the equivalent of it, with an outgoing administration and the incoming one completely agreeing and working together to get this done. Yes, this was all drafted by the Biden administration negotiators. But to close it, they needed the presence, not just the signal, not just the input. They needed the presence of Steve Witkoff, who is the President Trump's Middle East negotiator. Now, what was announced by the Qatari Prime Minister was that there are 3 parties who are responsible for monitoring this and 3 parties who are the guarantors of it. Now, the only real guarantor that matters in this case is the U.S. And the fact is, this is now a Trump administration agreement. It will be important, I think, for the Trump administration, for Steve Witkoff to put together a team of people who can be very active in terms of overseeing the implementation, because there are lots of potential problems with this implementation. You've got people returning in Gaza from the south to the north. They're not supposed to be carrying weapons. Is there a guarantee that they're not all going to be carrying weapons? Interesting question. There are Hamas fighters who are wounded who will be allowed to go to Egypt. Who is there an agreement on who they are? I mean, I can easily see problems cropping up, and this is where you'll need to have very clear understandings of what's been agreed, and very clear understandings from on the Israeli part, on the one hand, and I would say on the Hamas's part, at least as it relates to Qatar and Egypt will play a critical role here in terms of the implementation. A very clear understanding on everybody's part, how we understand what each of these provisions means and what we expect in terms of it being carried out. So there's been a lot of work that's gone into this, to say the least. There's a lot of work that's going to have to exist to help ensure that it gets implemented.
And then what about the ripple effect?
Well, there is an instant ripple effect. No, I'm glad you asked the question, because we know that one of the priorities that President Trump has is to expand the Abraham Accords. And that's a euphemism for saying Saudi-Israeli normalization. And the Saudis have made it very clear that, especially given the imagery that comes out of Gaza, which is an imagery that captures the death and destruction, the scope of which is literally hard to exaggerate. You know, by the way, in Israel, nobody sees it. In the Arab world, it's basically all they see. So for the Saudis, they want that war to be over, but that means they want Israel out of Gaza. So that will give President Trump and his administration an enormous incentive to make sure that all 3 phases of this agreement actually are carried out and implemented. It's only, we have a temporary ceasefire right now, and it goes on for 42 days, and 33 hostages will get released, and we will see close to 1,000 Palestinian prisoners released. Combination of those who have a lot of blood on their hands, a lot of people who were arrested since October 7th. And what we're going to see as this unfolds is on day 16 of the first phase, the negotiations for reaching understandings on phase 2 are to begin. They are to continue even if you finished the first phase and you haven't reached agreement. They are to continue into the second phase. But the aim of the second phase is to take what is a temporary ceasefire and turn it into a permanent ceasefire that then outlines the withdrawal of Israel from Gaza. So Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to say, and is saying, and he can legitimately say he's not agreed to end the war, because technically this agreement doesn't mean that there's a guarantee the war is going to end. But the fact is, you're supposed to, in phase 2, to reach an understanding that turns us into a permanent ceasefire. And if you don't achieve that in phase 2 and it falls apart and Israel resumes, I suspect that you'll see President Trump think, well, that's the agreement somehow hasn't been fulfilled. Now, if Hamas has violated it, he will be supportive of whatever the Israelis do. But if Hamas, and I would say that Hamas should have an interest in carrying this out, if they do, then it'll be pretty difficult to see this conflict resume, and you'll see the president's interest in doing a Saudi deal, I think, come to the fore in terms of helping to make sure a deal that the administration will own actually gets fulfilled.
That's fairly optimistic. And we see a lot of pessimism, especially coming out of some of the Israeli commentators who are critics of Netanyahu and his government.
That was Cipher Brief contributing editor Elaine Shannon talking with the former assistant to the president in the Middle East, Ambassador Dennis Ross. Well, up next, while President Trump did not end the war in Ukraine before taking office or even on his first day in office, there's still a lot of global anxiety over what he intends to do in the next 100 days to end that war. We'll be back in a minute with more on that with Ambassador Kurt Volker and retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges.
The future of national security is here. Introducing the Cipher Brief's NatSec Edge Conference, June 5th through 6th, 2025 in Austin, Texas. Join leaders from intelligence, defense, private industry, and investment as they explore the innovations shaping tomorrow's world. Gain critical insights, connect with top minds, and shape the future of security in an interconnected world. Don't just witness the future, be a part of it. Secure your spot now at natsekedge.com.
Welcome back to the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm Suzanne Kelly. Ukraine, Europe, and many in Washington are still deeply concerned about how President Trump might bring an end to Russia's war in Ukraine. One of the more controversial aspects of this story is centered on the relationship between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, which was considered a friendly relationship during the first Trump administration. But as we've mentioned, the world has changed dramatically since the first Trump administration, and Russia's deadly campaign demanding Ukrainian territory has had a brutal and costly toll. Cipher Brief managing editor Tom Nagorski spoke separately with Ambassador Kurt Volker, who served as U.S. ambassador to NATO during the first Trump administration, and retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges about what comes next.
Do you think it would be a good idea for him to meet with Vladimir Putin? We know a lot of Western leaders, including President Biden, were not going to do that or not, or do you have an opinion?
Yeah, well, my view is that he should call Putin, as he said he would do, and tell Putin to stop the war. And he should offer a meeting with Putin after the war is over. So not before, not as a way of getting there. That would show weakness and Trump being a supplicant, and Trump doesn't want to be in that position. But to offer that he's willing to meet with Putin, but after Putin stops the war, I think that would be reasonable.
In this case, I would agree with Ambassador Volker. I mean, Kurt is an expert diplomat, and he understands perceptions of things like this. And I would agree, especially, I mean, if President Trump has this leverage and this advantage, don't give it away by going to meet Putin somewhere, which is going to be a pretty limited number of places because he is indicted. Most countries would have to arrest him if he went there. So I think a phone call is not a bad idea. But again, it has to be, hey, let me tell you what, Vladimir, this is the deal. You know what? Ukraine is a sovereign country. It is in the interest of the United States and all of our allies that you are defeated, that you leave Ukraine and you live within your own borders. You're zero risk of you being attacked by any NATO country. So stop worrying about that. And I hope he does not automatically, and this you reminded me, one of the things that General Kellogg, they talked about, no NATO membership for 20 years or something. Why in the hell would we say that? NATO will get better the day that Ukraine joins the alliance. The Russians, though, they don't care about Ukraine joining NATO. What they care about is a Ukraine that is prosperous and free, and Ukrainian people that are doing extremely well right on their border. That's what he dreads more than anything. Now, you open the door on the security guarantee. There is no guarantee other than NATO membership. I've seen and heard all kinds of different formulas for how that might be worked out, even if part of Ukraine is still occupied by Russia. I think at the end of the day, unless you have U.S. troops that are there on the ground, or some kind of European force that looks like it could defeat any Russian formation that might attack, because the Russians will absolutely test it, then we don't need a bunch of blue helmeted guys from some other continent that are there. They will not be respected. They seldom are. It needs to be something like the NATO implementation force that went into Bosnia back in 1995. But the Ukrainians are not going to sit around. I mean, they know that they were not prepared back in 2022 when the large-scale invasion started. I was in Kyiv about 3 weeks before then, and right. Kyiv did not feel like a city that was getting ready for a war. So this time, I think when and where and however the fighting comes to a halt of some sort, I think the Ukrainians are going to get to work very quickly, fixing, improving, growing their own military, growing their defense industry, and fixing all the problems that they have now, so that they do become this porcupine that Russia will not want to attack again in 3 years once Russia has fixed all their own problems.
You probably already know that the Cipher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cipher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cipher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at thecipherbrief.com.
Welcome back to the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. Well, part of President Trump's legacy from his first term was the pressure he put on NATO member states to contribute more of their GDP on defense spending. Cipher Brief senior international correspondent Ian Mermishvili focused on what the new relationship between the U.S. and NATO might look like with former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Ian Brzezinski.
Ian Brzezinski, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about all things related to NATO, U.S. relations, Russia, Ukraine, and so forth. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, Ian, Happy New Year, and it's great to see you again, and thank you for bringing me on.
Thank you very much. Let's start from the U.S.-NATO relations. President Trump has made multiple statements in the past, as well as during the election campaign. And he also, lately, he's been proposing or pushing this idea for the NATO allies to spend 5% of their GDP on their own defense. What do you think about this idea?
I think it's actually a sound recommendation. We face a much more volatile and dangerous world. That's one of the realities he's unfortunately inheriting from the Biden administration. The world's become a more lethal place. We have a high-intensity war in Ukraine that's unresolved. We have the spreading of violence across the Middle East. The Houthis can still fire missiles against the ships in traversing the Red Sea. We have increasing Chinese predatory conduct, aggression in the Indo-Pacific. Not to mention a plethora of other threats. So we do need to spend more. I mean, think about this. During World War II, we spent, I think, roughly 37% of GDP to defeat the Axis. During the Korean War, it was 14% of GDP. During the Vietnam War, it was 9%. And one can make the case that was a less complex, less volatile, context, even while we had the Cold War. So 2% today is not going to cut it.
No.
And 5% to me sounds like a very reasonable figure if we're really going to, as an alliance, develop the deterrent posture, the defense capabilities necessary to protect and promote our interests.
Do you think it's
We're no longer
realistic?
talking about one theater. We're talking about 3 theaters that are now interconnected and on the cusp of metastasizing into something that could be a really global conflagration. And we're not prepared.
We're not prepared. Do you think it's realistic to ask the allies to push it up to 5%?
I started off the question with, what do we need to do? And I think that's what we need to do. And the transatlantic community is a community that has a GDP of $54 trillion. So we have the wealth. But this is the world of real decisions, right? And there has to be sacrifices made. And I would argue that sacrifice is worth it to prevent what could be a devastating, catastrophic set of conflagrations. It'll be far cheaper to spend that 5% now than to pay the human and financial costs of a broader war.
Where do you see NATO in the war in Ukraine and bringing the war to some sort of end point? Do you think NATO has a bigger role now moving forward?
This is a tragic war. It's a war that's cost over 1 million combatant casualties on both Russian and Ukrainian. It's displaced millions. It's destroying a democracy in the heart of Europe. That's Ukraine. And we have an interest in bringing this war to a swift and just end, and in a way that ensures enduring stability, at least military stability, on a continent that probably is going to have to face long-term confrontation with Russia. And if we want to achieve those objectives, the most effective way to do that is through NATO, with NATO playing a leadership role in the support of Ukraine and the securing of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And for me, the most effective way to do that is to extend NATO membership to Ukraine, including its Article 5 security guarantee. And that, in the current circumstance, would involve some sort of deterrent force that would deploy to Ukraine to, at a minimum, secure the territory or help Ukraine secure the territory it currently controls. Mm. That, I think, is the most effective way to bring this war to an end, and then also to set a foundation for military stability in the aftermath.
Do you think it would be possible to convince President Trump, who's been very skeptical about NATO, Ukraine's membership in NATO, to take some of those steps that you're just proposed?
How Trump manages this conflict, how he brings it to its next phase, so to speak, hopefully one which is an end of the fighting on just and stable terms, will define the credibility of his peace through strength strategy. If he does what he has said he would do during the campaign, that would be Chamberlain-like concessions that would strip Ukraine of its sovereignty and security and probably lead to a wider war. Trump doesn't want that, but he still has to be convinced. And so I would say there are 3 arguments you would make the case, 3 arguments and actions that the Europeans need to make to Trump. One is to leverage his fear of a wider war that would suck in U.S. involvement. That's the one thing Trump fears. He doesn't want to have on his watch another war, another endless war that drags in American troops. Second point would be that, if he wants his peace through strength national security strategy to have credibility, it's going to be defined by what he does on Ukraine. And if he makes concessions to the Russians that are extreme, that are strategically unstable, that reward aggression, peace through strength will be associated less with Churchill and more with Chamberlain. He doesn't want that. We don't want that. And the third thing is an action item, and it falls, I think, on the Europeans. And there's actually some legitimacy to it. They need to stand up now and say that they are willing to put together a deterrent force. I don't know if it's 50,000, 75,000 personnel, but a sufficient force that will be willing to go in and deploy into Ukraine to provide that deterrent capacity. And the request they would make to Trump is that they would want some American dimension in that. So this would be a deterrent force that they would propose that would be 80 to 90% European with an American dimension, probably a command and control arrangement or capacities like a headquarters, maybe some air assets and missile defense assets that we already have in Europe. Yeah. That would be the kind of burden sharing that Trump would expect. That's the kind of action that could help bring this war to an appropriate end. And that is something that Trump, I think, would find appealing because it would end the war, it would validate his peace through strength strategy, and it would demonstrate that he has led the Europeans to carry their share of the burden that he's been demanding for so long.
I'm Suzanne Kelly. We're back in just a moment to continue this conversation on the future of NATO and the U.S. relationship with NATO former Deputy Secretary General Ambassador Alexander Vershbow. Back in a minute.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
Welcome back to The World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. For another perspective on the future relationship between the U.S. and NATO, Cipher Brief Chief International Correspondent Ia Mermishvili spoke with the former Deputy Secretary General of that organization, Ambassador Alexander Vershbow.
Ambassador Vershbow, thank you very much for finding the time to talk to us, and welcome to the Cipher Brief.
It's good to be here.
How do you see U.S.-NATO relationship moving forward with the new administration coming to Washington?
A lot of uncertainty as to where President Trump and his administration will want to go, but I've been encouraged by the many statements in support of NATO during the confirmation hearings that have been taking place, and what we know about some of the key players, such as Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio. So there's still this threat hanging in the air of Trump wanting to downgrade NATO or even pull out of NATO. But I'm going to be an optimist that he will understand that it's in the U.S. interest to have strong allies, and they're what we call force multipliers in the business, and that with so many problems on the landscape, it's good to work with our allies rather than at cross purposes. Mm. So there's specific things that Trump cares a lot about, which is top of the list is defense spending. He does deserve at least some of the credit during his first term in, I have to say, bullying the allies into increasing spending, but they did the right thing. And at the same time, what they've done so far, while extremely positive, is not going to be enough.
So do you think the 5% of defense spending or GDP, 5% of GDP defense spending is a realistic goal?
Well, I would say it's very ambitious. It's not that it wouldn't be justified in terms of the gaps within the alliance and the gap between what the Europeans spend on defense and what the United States spends on defense. But there's probably an element of bargaining in his selection of 5%. So I would be very happy if we ended up somewhere in the 3 to 4% range. And as I said before, it's necessary. We're dealing with a much more dangerous security situation than during Trump's first term. Our adversaries are now more united and more capable militarily, as well as with all kinds of other subversive activities. So spending more is going to be absolutely essential. So I hope that's what he chooses to focus on rather than terminating NATO, which would be bad for everybody.
Biden administration just conducted the 25th contact group meeting. It was the last one of the Biden administration, and we don't know what the future holds for the Ramstein contact group. What do you think could happen, and what do you think should happen with that group?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, the Ramstein group, officially known as the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, has been an extremely effective mechanism in coordinating military assistance to Ukraine, to include both equipment, training, intelligence sharing. And I expect that it will continue to function in some similar way. A lot of military aid President Trump wants to give to Ukraine. I hope he'll keep up that aid because it gives Ukrainians leverage in any negotiation that may take place. But it's been a good example of transatlantic partnership with the U.S. Secretary of Defense chairing these meetings. I think NATO is already anticipating that there might be somewhat reduced engagement or participation by the United States, and they already began to revamp some of the institutional mechanisms that will allow the Ramstein group to continue to be effective, but with maybe a more even burden sharing with Europeans and other non-NATO countries. So I think that's going to be a success story that they will build on. There may be some other changes, but the important thing, of course, is the policy behind it, which is to help Ukraine build up the capacity to defeat the Russians in the short term and to deter any future Russian aggression after this war is over.
That was Cipher Brief Chief International Correspondent Ia Mermishvili talking with former Deputy Secretary General of NATO Ambassador Alexander Vershbow. Well, if there is one certainty about the second Trump administration, it is that there will be surprises. One of those surprises surfaced just before the president took his oath for the second term, when he mentioned that he wanted a lot more control and influence over Greenland. Why? Well, that's the question that Cipher Brief managing editor Tom Nagorski put to retired General Phil Breedlove. Why Greenland?
It's sort of like when you're talking to a real estate person these days. What is the first thing that comes out of their mouth? Location, location, location. And so much like Turkey in the Eastern Med, Greenland in the Northern Atlantic is the prime land when it comes to location, location, location. This has to do with several military factors, and then we'll talk about the other things. The first is this growing thing we call the Northern or Northwest Passage, whereby whether you believe in climate change or not, the ice is receding in the north. And as the ice recedes in the north, the passage opens up longer and longer every year, whereby commercial as well as military craft can go through there. Now, I've heard these two numbers, and it really depends on the type of ship, whatever. But from the ports of Europe to Asia is 14 days on that northern passage, way faster than going through the Mediterranean and around through the canal. And secondarily, from most northern, northeastern U.S. ports, it's about a 20-day transit. So when you save time like that, it is money. It means you can turn your capital ships around faster. This is a big commercial deal. And that's why we see China so interested in buying land in the Arctic Circle. They want to be on the Arctic Council. They want to be able to dictate terms to everyone else in the Arctic about how it will be used. Of course, Russia is looking to Greenland for a much different set of issues, primarily military control, extracting tax money, duty for the use of the Northern Passage, etc. Many in the world have never heard of what we call the GUIK, G-U-I-K gap, or G-I-U-K gap, sorry, GUIK gap. And that is essentially that body of water to the east of Greenland, Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, into the northern waters on the north side of Russia. And this is where all of their strategic navy is, all of their boomers, all of their big capital ships. All of this passes in and out of the GUIK gap as it's going into the Atlantic Ocean. So Russia is extremely keen to be able to use that gap to their advantage, and certainly not have somebody like America sitting on top of that. And then the last thing, although there are many, one more just quick thing.
Sure.
Just think about Russia and the United States. In between it in the north is Greenland. So for whatever missile defense shield we might need in the future, this is prime territory for things like that.
And can you talk a little bit, just picking up on your last point, General, about what the United States has now and has had, as I understand it, for a long time in terms of assets to, whether it's in the service of missile defense or actual missiles of our own, what American assets currently sit on the island of Greenland?
So our one base, we used to call it Thule. I will murder this name. It is an Inuit name, an indigenous name. Pitifuk now is the name of that base, I believe is the pronunciation. And so this is a big modern base. We've invested a lot of money in the past. We don't have a lot of forces on it, but we maintain hangar facilities, we maintain runway facilities, we maintain taxiways, all of the things to give us access to that base. And it's actually bigger than the United States. There have been times when we've had NATO missions on that base, and we're doing air defense and air definition and describing the context of the northern airspaces from that base, radars, et cetera, et cetera. And so this base is strategically very important to the United States. Derivatively, it is strategically important to NATO.
Right. And as I understand it, it serves, among other things, as a kind of early warning system if we need one for...
It's a part of our radar system and all of the things that does sensing, not only air, but missile sensing in the north.
And that's it for this episode of The World Deciphered. If you're looking for expert-level reporting and analysis of national and global security issues, I hope you will check out the cipherbrief.com every Monday through Friday. And remember, you can watch the full interviews from all of our conversations today on The World Deciphered on the Cipher Brief's YouTube channel. I also encourage you to stay up to speed with what's happening in the world with the Cipher Brief's open source report. That's a subscriber plus exclusive that you will only find at thecipherbrief.com. I'm Suzanne Kelly. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time right here on The World Deciphered.